fire roared behind him as the old Marine pulled the woman through the smoke, his lungs burning, his heart praying, "Lord, not her, not tonight." In that moment, he wasn't fighting a war, he was fighting fate. After years of silence, Jack Monroe returned to his snowy hometown with only his loyal German shepherd, Ranger. But peace didn't wait long. Darkness was already waiting in the shadows of the town. When a powerful man tried to burn down what was left of hope, Jack stood tall once more. In the ashes, he found not revenge, but redemption, faith, and a miracle he never expected. If this story touched your heart, share it, leave a comment about what moved you most, and don't forget to subscribe to Second Chance Story, where every tale reminds us that faith still lights the darkest nights. The winter wind swept through Asheville, North Carolina, like a ghost searching for warmth, carrying the smell of pine and distant wood smoke across the cobblestone streets. Frost clung stubbornly to the iron railings and the stained glass windows of the old quarter, where time seemed to slow, wrapped in a silver haze of cold. Inside a narrow bookshop at the corner of Maple and Church Street, the bell above the door chimed faintly as Margaret Harper unlocked the front latch. She moved with the careful grace of someone who had learned to live alone for too long. 64 years old, slender, with pale hands marked by years of labor and loneliness, she wore a gray wool coat that had lost its shine and a knitted scarf the color of faded lavender. Her hair, once chestnut, was now a cascade of silver pinned neatly behind her head. The soft lines on her face carried both kindness and sorrow, and her eyes, the color of sea glass, held the calm of a woman who had made peace with loss. She turned the wooden sign on the door that read, "Open," her fingers trembling slightly in the cold. Behind her, the small shop, Harper's Haven, was a sanctuary of dust, light, and the scent of aging paper. Books filled every corner, stacked like quiet witnesses of history. The air was still, except for the rhythmic tick of a clock and the whisper of snow brushing against the window. Margaret paused near a framed photograph on the counter, a man in uniform, smiling beside a much younger version of herself. Arthur Harper, her late husband, had been a historian and a dreamer. He died 10 winters ago, leaving her the store and a silence that had grown louder with each passing year. Since then, every morning felt like a conversation with ghosts, a ritual of sweeping the floor, dusting the shelves, and waiting for footsteps that rarely came. Across the street, inside the dim glow of a cafe, a group of young men huddled near the window, steam rising from their coffee cups. They laughed too loudly for the quiet street, their eyes wandering toward the bookstore. One of them, a tall man with a leather jacket and a scar beneath his lip, smirked as he exhaled a cloud of cigarette smoke. The laughter had an edge to it, a sound born not of joy, but of boredom and hunger for trouble. From the end of the block, the low hum of an engine broke the silence. A moss-green pickup truck, weathered by time and dust, rolled to a slow stop near the curb. The door creaked open, and a man stepped out into the drifting snow. Jack Monroe, 65, paused to take in the street as if measuring the weight of old memories. He was tall and broad, shouldered, his posture still straight despite the years carved into him. His face was weather, beaten, the skin tanned and rough, with a salt and pepper beard trimmed close to the jaw. A long scar traced the line from his temple to his cheek, a gift from a desert ambush decades ago. His blue eyes, sharp and alert, carried the distant calm of a man who had seen the worst of the world and survived it. Jack was a retired Marine Corps sergeant major, having served 35 years before his body finally forced him to stop. He carried himself with the quiet discipline of someone who had never unlearned the habit of scanning rooftops and alleyways. The weight of his coat concealed the still, muscular frame beneath, a reminder that strength, for him, was less about the body than the will. Beside him trotted Ranger, a 10-year-old German shepherd with a sable coat and intelligent amber eyes. The dog moved with purpose, tail low, head high, his breath steaming in the cold. Once a military working dog, Ranger had served beside Jack through 2 deployments. His ears flicked with every sound, the distant hum of tires, the whisper of wind against glass, the faint jingle of the bookstore bell. Jack bent slightly, running a gloved hand through the fur behind the dog's neck. "Easy, boy," he murmured, his voice low and steady. "We're just passing through." Yet even as he said it, his gaze lingered on the bookshop. Something about the golden light spilling from its windows called to him, like a memory of home, or maybe of peace. He had returned to Asheville for the first time in 30 years, drawn not by family, he had none left, but by restlessness, that uneasy companion of old soldiers. The small town hadn't changed much. The same brick facades, the same antique lampposts glowing weakly in the fog. But the people had. He could feel it in the way strangers looked at him. Curious, distant, perhaps a little afraid. Veterans were relics now, respected from afar, rarely understood. As he crossed the street, his boots crunching through the snow, he noticed the group of young men still watching. Their laughter faded when his eyes met theirs. He didn't glare. He didn't have to. There was something in his expression, a quiet authority that made people reconsider their next move. One of them stubbed out his cigarette, muttered something, and turned away. The bell above the bookstore door rang again as Jack entered. Warm air brushed his face, carrying the comforting aroma of lemon oil and paper. Margaret looked up from the counter, startled at first, then smiled faintly. "Good morning," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Looking for something in particular?" Jack hesitated before answering. "Just passing by. Thought I'd come in from the cold." His tone was deep, even, a voice that once gave orders but now carried weariness instead of command. Ranger sat obediently near the entrance, his gaze following Margaret's every move. She chuckled quietly. "That's quite a partner you have there." Jack allowed himself a small smile. "He's seen more of the world than most men I've known." There was a pause, a quiet exchange in which neither spoke, yet both felt something familiar stir. 2 souls that had each weathered their own wars, meeting in the eye of a peaceful storm. Margaret poured a cup of tea from a small kettle, her movements slow and deliberate, then handed it to him. "You look like you could use this." He accepted it with a nod. "Thank you, ma'am." As he took a sip, the window rattled from a gust of wind, and outside, the same group of young men crossed the street. Their silhouettes lingered near the lamppost, glancing toward the store once more before moving on. Jack's eyes followed them briefly, the muscles in his jaw tightening. Old instincts stirred, observation, calculation, readiness. Margaret noticed the change in his expression. "Is something wrong?" "Nothing yet," he replied quietly, setting the cup down. "But this town doesn't feel as quiet as it looks." Snow began to fall harder, tapping gently against the glass. Margaret turned toward the window, watching the flakes blur the world outside. Behind her, Jack remained still, listening to the muffled sound of laughter fading into the distance. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man passing through. Something told him that whatever peace he had been searching for would not come easy, but it might be waiting here, in this fragile, frost-covered town. And somewhere beneath that certainty, deep in his chest, the old soldier felt something he had long forgotten, the faint, unsteady warmth of purpose. The afternoon had deepened into a dim gray haze when the snow began to fall harder, cloaking the street outside in silence. Inside Harper's Haven, the golden light from a single hanging lamp swayed slightly, casting soft shadows over the rows of books. The bell above the door jingled, a sound that should have meant comfort. But Margaret Harper froze. The moment she turned, 3 men stepped inside, shaking snow from their boots, the smell of smoke and cheap whiskey clinging to their coats. The one in front was clearly the leader. He was a thin man in his 30s, sharp-faced, with slicked back black hair and a stubble that shadowed his jaw. His eyes were pale gray, cold, darting, like those of a rat. He wore a leather jacket too small for his narrow shoulders and moved with the restless twitch of someone who had spent his life watching his back. His name, though Margaret did not yet know it, was Jesse Crow, a small time enforcer for a man whose name carried weight in Asheville's underbelly. Behind him came 2 others, Earl, a broad-shouldered brute with a face like carved stone and broken knuckles, and Toby, younger, thin as wire, his hands buried in his pockets, eyes flicking nervously between the shelves. "Nice place you've got here," Jesse said, his tone lazy, each word stretched like chewing gum. "Shame if something happened to it." His voice was smooth but empty, a performance he had rehearsed too many times. Margaret's spine stiffened. "What do you want?" Jesse grinned. "We sell protection, ma'am. This neighborhood's not what it used to be. $400 a week, and nobody touches your books." Margaret's eyes flickered toward the phone near the register. "And if I say no?" Earl stepped forward, his boots creaking against the wood. He was massive, 6'4", a mountain of muscle wrapped in a worn army jacket. There was an old scar above his right eyebrow, the kind you get from bar fights or broken bottles. His voice was deep and slow. "Then maybe something gets broken." Margaret took a breath. She had faced harder days, but the tremor in her hand betrayed her fear. "You should leave," she said, her tone calm but quivering at the edges, "before I call the police." Toby laughed softly, but it was the laugh of someone uncomfortable, not cruel. "She's got fire, Jess." Jesse's smile vanished. "Don't test me, lady." And before she could react, he shoved the nearest bookshelf. It toppled with a crash, sending volumes of history tumbling across the floor. Margaret stumbled backward, hitting the counter. Dust filled the air, mingling with the bitter scent of smoke. Jesse leaned close enough for her to smell the whiskey on his breath. "You've got 24 hours, he hissed. "Next time it's not the shelf." The doorbell rang again as they left, laughter echoing down the street. For a long moment, Margaret stood frozen, the only sound the ticking of the clock and her own heartbeat. She sank to her knees, picking up the fallen books with trembling hands, whispering the titles under her breath as if naming old friends. Outside, Jack Monroe and Ranger were walking past, their footprints pressing into the thickening snow. Ranger's ears perked. The dog stopped, tail stiff, and gave a low growl. Jack frowned, glancing toward the faint light of the bookstore window. Then he heard it, a muffled crash, the sound of wood splintering. Without a second thought, he pushed the door open. The bell rang again, this time announcing something different. Not customers, but guardians. Margaret turned, startled. Jack filled the doorway, tall and broad, his presence alone seeming to steady the air. Snow dusted his shoulders and the brim of his old marine cap. Ranger slipped in beside him, nose twitching, moving like a shadow of instinct. "Ma'am," Jack said quietly, scanning the mess. "Are you hurt?" Margaret shook her head, though her breath was uneven. "No, just frightened." He bent down, picking up a fallen book, a thick, leather-bound volume on the Civil War. The spine was cracked, but the pages were intact. "Looks like someone didn't appreciate history," he muttered. Ranger circled the room, sniffing along the floorboards, tail low but steady. "They said they'd come back," Margaret whispered. "Tomorrow, for money." Jack stood slowly, setting the book back on the counter. The lamplight caught the scar on his cheek as his jaw tightened. "Did you call the police?" She gave a weary smile. "By the time they arrive, those men will be long gone." Jack exhaled through his nose, steady and controlled. "You got cameras?" "One," she said, pointing to a small black lens hidden above the door. "My husband installed it years ago." "Good man," Jack murmured. "You should keep it running. And if they come back, don't open the door." Margaret looked at him, studying his face. Beneath the rough exterior, there was something unmistakably gentle. "You speak as if you've seen this before." He met her gaze. "I've seen worse, but I've also seen what happens when good people stop standing their ground." She hesitated, then nodded. "Why are you helping me?" Jack looked toward Ranger, who had finished his inspection and sat patiently by the door, eyes alert. "Because sometimes the only thing between right and wrong is who's willing to stay in the room." A silence hung between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two souls recognizing something familiar. Loss, resilience, the weight of years. Margaret finally said, "Would you have tea with me? It's the least I can offer." Jack gave a half smile, rare but real. "Tea sounds just fine." They sat by the window as snow thickened outside, 2 cups steaming on the table between them. The world beyond the glass blurred into white, and for the first time that night, Margaret felt the faintest warmth of safety. Ranger lay beside her chair, resting his head on his paws, one ear tilted toward the door. The dog didn't sleep. He never did, not fully. He had been trained for danger, for nights when silence meant threat. Jack glanced at the clock. It was nearing 8. "I'll walk you home when you close," he said. Margaret smiled softly. "This is my home." He nodded once, understanding without another word. Outside, in the dark alley behind the cafe, Jessie Crow leaned against a wall, watching the bookstore window through the curtain of falling snow. A cigarette burned between his fingers, the ember glowing like a single angry star. He didn't like how the old Marine had looked at him. There was something about that man, too calm, too sure, that made his stomach twist with unease. When his phone buzzed, Jessie answered in a low voice. "Yeah, boss, we've got a problem. There's a soldier in the mix." The voice on the other end was smooth, steady, and frighteningly polite. "Then you'd better make sure it's handled. We don't tolerate defiance." Jessie crushed the cigarette under his boot. The snow hissed as it swallowed the ember. He looked back toward the lighted window one last time, muttering to himself, "You picked the wrong town, old man." Inside, Margaret and Jack finished their tea. She thanked him for staying, and he promised to check in the next day. As he stepped out into the cold with Ranger, the streetlight flickered, casting his shadow long across the snow. For the first time in years, Jack felt something awakening in him. Not the instinct to fight, but the resolve to protect. He glanced down at Ranger. "We'll stay close, boy. Something tells me this town isn't done with us yet." The dog gave a soft huff, as if in agreement, and together they disappeared into the white silence of the night. The snow outside Harper's Haven had thickened into a white curtain by midnight. The streetlights glowed faintly through the storm, their halos blurred by the swirling flakes. The entire block was silent except for the occasional creak of ice shifting on the rooftops. Inside, Jack Monroe moved with the quiet precision of an old craftsman. His rough hands, scarred and strong, tightened the last screw on the reinforced door latch he had installed earlier that evening. Every movement was deliberate, honed from years of habit. Check the locks, watch the angles, stay aware. Ranger lay near the counter, his head resting on his paws, but his amber eyes never truly closed. The German Shepherd was trained to rest in stillness, not sleep. His breathing matched the rhythm of the storm outside. Margaret Harper sat behind the counter, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes following Jack's every move. The lamplight softened the lines on her face, revealing not weakness, but quiet endurance. She had tried to insist that he go home for the night, but Jack had simply replied, "The storm's just an excuse, they'll use it too." His tone was calm, without bravado. At nearly 1 a.m, the only sound was the ticking of the old wall clock. Margaret finally broke the silence. "You remind me of my husband," she said softly. "He used to fix things around the shop, too. But when he worked, he whistled." Jack gave a faint smile. "Then I'll have to disappoint you. Never learned to whistle." Margaret chuckled, a thin thread of laughter that seemed to warm the room for a moment. Ranger's tail thumped once against the floor, the closest thing he ever offered to laughter. But peace never lasted long for men like Jack. At 1:17 a.m., the small brass bell above the door trembled. Just a sound, faint but wrong, too careful, too slow. Jack's eyes snapped open. He had been sitting in the armchair near the door, pretending to rest. Without a word, he stood, his boots silent on the wooden floor. Ranger's body tensed, muscles rippling beneath his coat. 3 silhouettes slipped through the half-open door, their movements cautious, purposeful. The cold wind followed them, carrying the scent of kerosene and burnt tobacco. One whispered, "Quickly, light it and get out." Jack waited until he saw the gleam of the lighter. Then he spoke, his voice cutting through the dark like steel. "You strike that flame, and you'll never get the chance to regret it." The men froze. One of them, young, nervous, the same twitchy Toby from before, hesitated near the shelves. "It's him," he whispered. "The old Marine." "Shut up," hissed the leader, Jesse Crow. His pale eyes glinted in the dim light. "Do it." But before the lighter could spark, a low growl rolled through the room, deep, resonant, primal. Ranger lunged forward like a bullet of fur and muscle, his teeth snapping inches from the man's wrist. The canister of kerosene fell, clattering across the floor. Panic erupted. Jesse swung a metal pipe, but Jack was already moving. The old Marine closed the distance in 2 steps, his body still fast, still efficient. He caught Jesse's arm mid-swing, twisting until the younger man's knees buckled. The pipe clanged to the ground. Jack pivoted, driving his elbow into another attacker's ribs, a dull, heavy thud. The man gasped, doubling over, and Jack swept his legs out from under him. Toby backed toward the door, hands raised, eyes wide. "We didn't mean to hurt her, sir. I swear." "Then run," Jack said quietly. "And don't look back." The boy didn't need to be told twice. He bolted into the snow, vanishing into the storm. Jessie snarled, trying to break free, but Jack's grip was unrelenting. "You think this is courage?" Jack asked, his voice low and steady. "Extortion? Threatening a woman?" Jessie spat blood onto the floor. "You don't know who you're messing with, old man. There's a man above me. He owns this city." Jack's eyes hardened. "Then tell him he just lost his grip on it." Ranger barked once, sharp, commanding. The last conscious thug whimpered, clutching his arm where the dog's teeth had torn through his sleeve. Jack released Jessie, letting him fall to the ground. The man lay there for a moment, panting, then crawled toward the door. "You'll regret this," he muttered before disappearing into the blizzard. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind screaming outside. Jack straightened slowly, his breath visible in the cold air. He glanced toward Margaret. She stood frozen near the counter, both hands clasped tightly around a cup she hadn't realized she was holding. When their eyes met, she exhaled a shuddering breath. "You could have been killed." Jack shook his head. "Not tonight." He knelt beside Ranger, checking the dog's fur for cuts. "You did good, partner." Ranger wagged his tail once, then resumed his watchful stance near the window. Margaret set the cup down and walked toward him. "You've saved my life twice now. How can I ever repay that?" Jack looked around the room. The overturned chairs, the spilled books, the faint smell of kerosene that clung to everything. "You can keep this place open," he said simply. "That's payment enough." Outside, sirens began to wail in the distance, their echoes muffled by snow. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She sank into the nearest chair, her hands trembling. "Arthur used to say this shop was our heartbeat. I thought when he died, it stopped beating. But tonight—" She stopped herself, wiping her eyes. "Tonight, it feels alive again." Jack said nothing. He picked up a fallen American flag that had been draped over one of the high shelves, a relic Arthur had kept from his military days. Jack unfolded it carefully, running a thumb along the stitched stars. "He served?" Margaret nodded. "He was in the Navy, spent his last years teaching history to kids who didn't care about it." Jack smiled faintly. "Then he did something harder than any war." He hung the flag back on the wall, straight and true. Ranger sat beneath it, his head slightly tilted, as if standing guard. The lamplight caught the flag's edges, making it ripple like a memory. Margaret stepped closer to Jack. "You shouldn't have to do this alone," she said softly. "Stay here, at least until the storm passes." Jack hesitated, but there was something in her voice, a quiet plea that reached the part of him he thought had long gone cold. "All right," he said finally, "but I'll take the chair by the door." As the night deepened, the blizzard raged outside, a furious dance of wind and ice. Yet inside Harper's Haven, warmth persisted. The crackle of the small stove, the faint hum of the old clock, and the steady breathing of a Marine and his dog, keeping watch beneath the flag. When dawn came, the world outside was buried in white, and the town still slept. But inside the bookstore, a promise had been forged, unspoken, but stronger than any oath. Morning came slow to Asheville, the storm easing into a pale gray hush that blanketed the streets. The town looked peaceful again, but peace had never fooled Jack Monroe. It was the kind that came after a gunshot, the quiet before someone noticed the blood. Inside Harper's Haven, the air smelled faintly of burnt kerosene and damp wood. The damage from the night before had been swept away, but the tension still clung to the room like smoke. 2 police officers stood near the counter. The younger one, Officer Grant Ellis, couldn't have been older than 25. He had a fresh, clean, shaven face and an earnestness that made him look out of place amid the broken shelves and cracked floorboards. His blue eyes darted nervously from the door to Jack, who sat in a chair by the window, silent and unmoving. Ellis's uniform was crisp, but his posture betrayed unease. He wasn't used to real trouble, only parking tickets and noise complaints. Beside him, Sergeant Linda Reyes, mid-40s, short, dark hair tucked beneath her cap, olive skin, and a face lined by both authority and exhaustion, was filling out a report. She had the no-nonsense air of someone who had seen enough crime to stop believing in easy resolutions. "So," she said, glancing up, "you're telling me 3 armed men broke into this shop in the middle of a blizzard, got themselves beaten senseless by a retired Marine and his dog, and then just walked away?" Jack met her eyes, calm and unflinching. "Not all of them walked." Linda scribbled something in her notebook. "You're lucky to be alive, Mr. Monroe. These kinds of people don't stop after one bad night." "They'll come back," Jack said evenly. "But they won't make the same mistake twice." Reyes studied him for a moment. "You're not planning on handling this your way, are you?" Jack didn't answer, which was answer enough. Ranger sat near the door, his ears twitching whenever someone moved. His coat gleamed under the weak morning light, his calm more unnerving than any snarl. Margaret stood behind the counter, trying to appear composed as she poured coffee for the officers. Her hands trembled slightly when she handed Jack his cup. "They said it was just a robbery," she murmured. "But this doesn't feel like a robbery." The young officer, Ellis, hesitated before speaking. "Mrs. Harper, between us, it isn't. The 2 men we picked up last night, they work for Victor Hale. That name mean anything to you?" Jack's grip on the cup tightened. "It should." His voice carried a controlled edge, one that made the young cop falter. Reyes shot her partner a look, but Ellis pressed on. "Hale runs Hale Logistics, shipping, warehouses, trucking lines. Half the city's goods move through him. The department's been after him for years, but he's always 3 steps ahead. These weren't street thugs. They were sending a message." Jack set his cup down, the sound sharp against the wood. "Then I'll send one back." Reyes exhaled through her nose. "Mr. Monroe, I don't need another body on my hands. You're not in uniform anymore. Let us handle this." Jack leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to something almost gentle. "With all due respect, Sergeant, you can't handle men like Hale. He buys people who try." Reyes didn't flinch, but her silence was telling. She knew he wasn't wrong. When they left, Margaret locked the door behind them. For a long while, neither she nor Jack spoke. The snow outside had turned to sleet, ticking softly against the windows. Finally, she said, "You know him, don't you?" Jack's jaw tightened. "Men like Hale don't change. Different faces, same greed. I've seen his type in places the law forgot existed." He rubbed the scar on his cheek, a habit that surfaced whenever memories clawed their way up. In Kandahar, there was a man who ran a transport route. Smuggled weapons, drugs, people. Same look in his eyes, cold, efficient. Power for power's sake. Margaret's voice softened. "And you stopped him?" Jack gave a small, bitter smile. For a while. Later that evening, Harper's Haven was closed early. The storm had returned, wind howling down the narrow street. Margaret lit a small fire in the stove while Jack sat nearby, cleaning a battered hunting knife with slow, methodical movements. The blade wasn't military issue, but it carried the same weight of purpose. Ranger lay near the door, gaze fixed on the flickering shadows. Every so often he'd lift his head, ears pricking at a sound only he could hear. Jack's eyes would follow, his instincts kicking in even when logic told him it was just the wind. The knock on the door was soft, almost polite. Margaret startled. Jack was already standing. He moved to the window, staying to the side of the frame as he peered out. A man stood in the snow, a tall figure in a dark overcoat, his face obscured by the hood. The posture was calm, deliberate, too confident for someone lost in a storm. "Stay here," Jack whispered. He stepped to the door, opened it a few inches, and spoke without raising his voice. "Shop's closed." The stranger looked up, revealing a face lean and sharp, with a neatly trimmed beard flecked with silver. His eyes were green, bright, calculating, and utterly fearless. "I'm not here for books," he said smoothly. "Mr. Monroe, I believe we have mutual acquaintances." Jack studied him in silence. "You're with Hale." "Not with for." The man extended a hand he knew wouldn't be taken. "Name's Silas Trent. Mr. Hale prefers conversations to headlines. He asked me to deliver an invitation." Jack's expression didn't change. "Tell him I'm not interested in joining his book club." Silas smiled faintly, unbothered. "You've made an impression, old man. Hale doesn't like impressions he didn't order. He'll be in town tomorrow evening, at the Blue Ridge Hotel. He'd appreciate a chat. You show up, maybe this little shop stays quiet. You don't." He let the pause hang, then gestured toward the window. "Accidents happen, fires, storms. It's an unpredictable season." Before Jack could reply, Ranger growled, a low, rolling sound that made Silas's eyes flick down. "Beautiful animal," he said with an amused grin. "Trained to kill, I assume?" Jack stepped closer, his presence filling the doorway. "Trained to protect. You decide which side you're on." Silas's grin widened, but his eyes cooled. "Tomorrow, then." He turned and walked into the storm, his figure swallowed by the snow. Jack closed the door and locked it. Margaret was standing behind him, pale but resolute. "You're not going, are you?" He stared into the fire for a long time before answering. "I don't have a choice. Men like Hale don't send warnings. They send premonitions." Margaret stepped closer, placing a trembling hand on his arm. "Then you're not going alone." Jack looked at her, then at Ranger. The dog lifted his head, amber eyes glowing in the firelight. "No," Jack said quietly. "I'm not." Outside, the snow fell harder, erasing footprints as fast as they appeared. The night hid the city's corruption beneath its clean white blanket, but Jack Monroe knew better. Beneath every layer of snow, something darker waited. The night Victor Hale made his move, Asheville slept beneath a sky of bruised gray and flickering snow. The city lights shimmered faintly through the mist, and somewhere deep within the old quarter, a quiet bookstore waited, its windows dark, its shelves heavy with stories that had survived everything except greed. Hale's men came like shadows, their boots silent on the frost. They moved with precision, guided by a plan not their own. At their head was Silas Trent, his tailored coat buttoned high against the wind, his green eyes gleaming with cold amusement. He didn't believe in chaos. He believed in messages, and tonight's message would be written in flame. Inside Harper's Haven, Margaret Harper had fallen asleep in the chair near the stove, a wool blanket over her shoulders. Ranger lay beside her, breathing slow, the tip of his ear flicking at every crackle of the fire. Jack Monroe stood near the window, the outline of his broad frame dark against the faint streetlight. He hadn't slept. Men like him rarely did when storms whispered the wrong way. Then Ranger growled, a low, steady rumble that rolled through the silence. Jack's eyes shifted. He caught a reflection of movement in the window, shapes in the fog, the faint flare of a lighter, the glint of glass bottles. His hand tightened around the curtain. "They're here," he murmured. By the time the first Molotov hit the doorframe, Jack had already moved. "Margaret!" he shouted, pulling her upright. The explosion of fire lit the front room in a wave of orange. Glass shattered, and the air filled with the thick scent of burning paper. Flames crawled up the curtains, devouring decades of memory. Margaret's voice broke. "The books, Jack, the books!" He grabbed her arm firmly but gently. "We don't have time for ghosts." He turned to Ranger, whose hackles were raised, eyes burning gold in the firelight. "Basement, now!" Smoke poured through the ceiling beams. Jack moved fast, guiding Margaret toward the back room. She stumbled once, coughing, clutching her shawl to her face. He kicked open the trapdoor he had discovered weeks earlier, a narrow staircase leading to an old wine cellar built during World War II. The air below was cold, heavy with dust and old stone. Ranger went first, descending like a phantom, nose leading the way. Jack lowered Margaret down, his rough hands steady despite the roar above them. "Stay low," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "There's an old exit tunnel behind the shelves. It runs under the alley." "How did you know that?" she gasped. "I didn't," he said, pulling aside a crate to reveal a half-collapsed brick arch. "I guessed." They crawled through, the tunnel narrow and damp, the sound of fire rumbling like distant thunder overhead. Margaret's breath came in short bursts. Jack glanced back every few seconds to make sure she was still with him. Ranger trotted ahead, stopping once to glance back, his eyes seeming to say, "Keep moving." When they emerged into the alley, the night air hit them like a blessing. The snow had turned to sleet, dousing their coats in icy drops. Behind them, Harper's Haven burned bright against the dark, an inferno swallowing everything but the sky. Margaret turned toward it, her face streaked with tears. "It's all gone," she whispered. Jack looked at the flames, his expression carved from stone. "Not all. You're still here." He turned to Ranger. "Stay with her." "Jack, where are you going?" she demanded, grabbing his arm. He looked down at her, those same sea-glass eyes that had once seen only peace now filled with fear. "There's a man who thinks he can burn a town and sleep through the night. I'm going to remind him he can't." Before she could stop him, he was gone, disappearing into the storm like a soldier walking into memory. The Blue Ridge Hotel loomed above the river, its grand facade veiled in fog. Inside, Victor Hale stood before a glass window, a tumbler of whiskey in his hand. He was a man of controlled indulgence, mid-50s, tall, immaculately dressed, with silver hair combed back and a face carved in arrogance. His eyes were pale, the color of ash, and his hands bore the manicured confidence of someone who had never lifted anything heavier than a pen or a secret. Around him stood 3 guards in dark suits, their expressions dull but alert. Hale turned to Silas Trent, who stood near the fireplace, coat still damp from the snow. "Is it done?" Silas smiled faintly. "Done enough. The store's an oven by now." Hale swirled his drink. "And the woman?" Silas hesitated. "The fire doesn't ask questions." Hale chuckled softly. "Efficient as always." He raised the glass to his lips. To ashes, then. A voice came from the shadows near the door. You'll want to hold that toast. The guard spun, but too late. Jack Monroe stepped into the light, his coat smoking from melted snow, eyes cold as the mountains outside. He moved with quiet purpose, like a man who had decided long ago how this story would end. Ranger followed close behind, silent as a shadow, his fur slick and dark. Silas reached for his pistol, but Jack's hand was faster. A single motion, an elbow to the wrist, a twist, and the gun clattered across the marble floor. Ranger lunged at the nearest guard, driving him back against the wall with a snarl that tore through the stillness. "Mr. Hale," Jack said, his voice low, controlled. "You burned a woman's life tonight. For what? Fear? Profit?" Hale set his glass down, trying to mask his trembling hand. "You don't understand how this city works, old man. Everything has a price, even conscience." Jack stepped closer until they were face to face. "Then I guess you're bankrupt." The last guard charged. Jack sidestepped, grabbed the man's coat, and sent him crashing through the coffee table. Hale backed toward the window, panic breaking through his polished mask. "You can't. You're no law." "No," Jack said. "Just a man who's tired of watching people like you win." He grabbed Hale by the collar and shoved him toward the elevator, down the hall, through the smoke-filled lobby. Sirens wailed in the distance. When the fire trucks arrived, they found Jack Monroe standing in the snow outside the burning bookstore, his silver hair glowing in the light of the flames. Beside him knelt Victor Hale, bound with a length of telephone wire, his face pale and wet from melted snow. Jack looked at the approaching officers, his voice rough but steady. "This didn't need a war," he said. "Just a little courage." Behind him, Margaret appeared, wrapped in a blanket, her face streaked with soot. She saw Jack's figure through the haze, battered, unyielding, and for the first time since Arthur's death, she felt something like peace. Ranger limped to her side and pressed his head against her hand. A month later, Harper's Haven reopened. The scent of fresh, cut pine filled the room, and sunlight pooled on the new oak floorboards. The townspeople had rebuilt it together. Students, neighbors, veterans, each leaving behind a piece of themselves. On the back wall hung 2 photographs, one of Arthur Harper in his Navy uniform, the other of Jack Monroe and Ranger, standing side by side in the snow. Margaret arranged a vase of winter lilies by the window. Jack stood beside her, his shoulders finally at rest. He placed a hand on Ranger's head. "We did good, didn't we, boy?" Ranger wagged his tail once, slow and content. Outside, the first snow of the new year began to fall, soft, forgiving, like a curtain closing on an old story. The bell above the door chimed, gentle as breath, and for the first time, Jack Monroe allowed himself to smile. The fire roared behind him as the old Marine pulled the woman through the smoke, his lungs burning, his heart praying, "Lord, not her, not tonight." In that moment, he wasn't fighting a war, he was fighting fate. After years of silence, Jack Monroe returned to his snowy hometown with only his loyal German shepherd, Ranger. But peace didn't wait long. Darkness was already waiting in the shadows of the town. When a powerful man tried to burn down what was left of hope, Jack stood tall once more. In the ashes, he found not revenge, but redemption, faith, and a miracle he never expected. If this story touched your heart, share it, leave a comment about what moved you most, and don't forget to subscribe to Second Chance Story, where every tale reminds us that faith still lights the darkest nights.